My name is Eleanor Whitman, and the day my mother-in-law announced that 25 of her friends would be spending Christmas in my house without asking me, I smiled and booked a vacation instead. What she didn't know, as her face drained of color, was that the house she was so eager to claim would soon teach her a lesson about respect boundaries and the quiet power of a woman who has finally had enough. It happened on a cold December afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low and gray, and the air smells faintly of pine from the artificial tree I had just finished fluffing in the living room. I was standing on a step stool, trying to get the lights just right, when I heard her voice behind me, sharp, cheerful, and already certain of itself. "Eleanor," she said, clapping her hands together, like she was calling a meeting to order. "I've decided my friends will be spending Christmas here this year. All of them." I climbed down slowly, careful not to lose my balance. "All of them?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yes," she said, waving her hand as if the details were too small to matter. "Just 25 people. It'll be lively, don't you think? 25 people. In my house. On Christmas." For a moment, I didn't speak. I looked around the living room. The couch I'd saved for the rug I vacuumed twice a week. The framed photos of our children when they were young. I thought of the kitchen of the oven that barely fit one turkey, let alone enough food to feed a small army. And I thought of myself at 62 years old, with arthritis in my hands and a heart that had learned over decades how to swallow words before they ever reached my mouth. I smiled. "Perfect," I said. Her eyebrows lifted, surprised by my lack of resistance. "I knew you'd understand," she replied. "I'll give you a list of dishes tomorrow. Oh, and you'll need to deep clean the guest bathroom. My friend Marjorie is very particular." I nodded, still smiling. "Actually, I said I'm going on vacation. I leave next week." The room went quiet. Even the hum of the heater seemed to pause. "You're what?" she asked. "I'm going on vacation," I repeated. "You can cook and clean. I'm not your servant." Her mouth opened, then closed. The color drained from her cheeks so fast, I almost worried she might faint. Almost. But that moment, the shock, the silence, the sharp intake of her breath was only the beginning. Later that evening, after she'd retreated to the guest room she'd claimed as her own years ago, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and let the memories come. Christmases passed, lined up in my mind, like old ornaments pulled from a dusty box. Every year the same routine. I cooked, I cleaned, I hosted. She criticized the gravy, rearranged my table settings, and told stories that painted herself as the matriarch holding everyone together. And every year, I told myself it was easier to stay quiet. My husband, Frank, meant well, but he had learned long ago that peace, however fragile, came from not challenging his mother. "That's just how she is," he'd say, shrugging, as if that explained everything. And for a long time, I believed my role was to endure. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the way my hands ached more each morning. Maybe it was the realization that our children were grown building lives of their own, while I was still trapped in the same patterns. Or maybe it was simply the exhaustion of being invisible in my own home. The next morning, my mother-in-law cornered me in the hallway. "You weren't serious about leaving," she said, her voice tight. "Christmas is about family." "So is respect," I replied, passing her with my laundry basket. I booked a small condo near the coast that afternoon. Nothing fancy, just a place with a view of the water. and enough quiet to hear my own thoughts again. As I clicked the confirmation email, my hands trembled, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to relief. She didn't speak to me for days after that. When she did, it was to remind me of everything I was forgetting to do. The grocery list, the menu planning, the guest linens. Each reminder bounced off me like rain on a windshield. What she didn't know, and what I had never bothered to correct, was that the house was mine. Not ours, mine. Purchased with money I inherited from my parents long before Frank and I married. I had kept the deed in a safe, tucked away with insurance papers and old tax returns. It had never mattered before. Until now, as Christmas drew closer, I packed my suitcase quietly. Frank watched me from the doorway one night, his expression uncertain. "Do you really have to go?" he asked. "I really do," I said. When I zipped the bag shut, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. The day I left, my mother-in-law stood in the foyer, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. I kissed Frank on the cheek, picked up my keys, and walked out without looking back. Behind me, I could almost hear the sound of assumptions cracking. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not my mother-in-law, not even our children. Only Frank knew I'd be by the coast, and even then, I kept the details vague. The drive itself felt strange, like sneaking out of a life I'd been living on autopilot for decades. As the miles passed, so did the weight in my chest, but it didn't disappear entirely. Freedom, I was learning, comes with its own kind of ache. Sitting alone that first evening, I found myself replaying the years that led me there. It wasn't one big insult that pushed me to leave. It was hundreds of small ones, stacked neatly like unpaid bills. The way my mother-in-law, Doris, would inspect the corners of the living room with her finger, then wipe it on a tissue. The way she'd announce guests were coming over as if I were a hotel clerk, not a woman with a life and a body that tired more easily these days. When Frank and I first married, Doris didn't live with us. She had her own apartment, then her own routines. I respected her, even admired her independence. But after her fall, nothing serious, just a broken wrist, she moved in temporarily. That temporary arrangement stretched into years. Somewhere along the way, the house stopped feeling like mine and started feeling like a stage where I performed the role of the agreeable wife and dutiful daughter-in-law. I told myself I was doing it for family, for harmony, for peace. But peace, I learned, can be very expensive. Every Thanksgiving, Doris would invite people I barely knew. Old co-workers, church friends, neighbors from decades past. She'd sit in the living room, holding court, while I stood in the kitchen, stirring, chopping, timing, everything just right. When I finally sat down, my food was cold, and she'd say, "Oh, Eleanor, you really should have rested more before cooking. You look tired." I was tired, bone deep, tired. As I walked along the beach the next morning, the cold wind stinging my cheeks, I thought about how easily I'd let my needs slide, how I'd mistaken silence for strength. In our generation, especially for women, we were taught that endurance was a virtue. You didn't complain. You didn't draw lines. You made things work, even if it meant shrinking yourself in the process. Back home, Christmas preparations were underway without me. Frank called that afternoon. His voice was hesitant, like he was stepping onto thin ice. "Mom's overwhelmed," he said. She didn't realize how much work it would be. I closed my eyes and pictured Doris in the kitchen, staring at the counters, the sink, the empty refrigerator. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something quieter, confirmation. She invited them, I said gently. She can handle it. There was a pause. She keeps asking when you're coming back. I'll be home after Christmas. That was all I said. Later, as the sun dipped low over the water, I sat by the window and let myself feel the grief beneath my resolve. I loved my family. I loved the memories, even the hard ones. What hurt most wasn't Doris's entitlement. It was how invisible I'd become in my own story. How easily my efforts were assumed, my boundaries ignored. I thought about the house, about my parents long gone who had worked their entire lives so I'd have security. They taught me to stand on my own feet, to know my worth. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that lesson. Or maybe I'd just been waiting for the right moment to remember it. Christmas Eve arrived quietly for me. No frantic cooking, no guest lists taped to the fridge. Just a simple dinner and the sound of waves in the distance. I lit a candle and said a small prayer, not for revenge, but for clarity, for the strength to keep my footing when I returned. Back home, the cracks were widening. Frank called again that night. His voice was tired, now stripped of excuses. Mom's friends are demanding, he admitted. They keep asking where things are. Who's cooking breakfast? Who's cleaning up? I almost laughed, but stopped myself. I hope you're helping, I said. I am, he replied. And for the first time, I heard something new in his tone, understanding. The years of silent sacrifice were finally being seen, not because I shouted, but because I stepped away. As I went to bed that night, I realized something important. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about teaching them and myself that love without respect becomes obligation, and obligation over time turns into resentment. I had carried that weight long enough. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't dreading it. By Christmas morning, I had settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar. I woke without an alarm, made coffee slowly, and watched the steam curl upward, as if time itself had loosened its grip. There was no schedule taped to the refrigerator, no voice reminding me of what still needed to be done. Just quiet, and in that quiet, I understood something clearly. For the first time, my decision hadn't been impulsive. It had been inevitable. The smile I gave Doris that afternoon wasn't fake. It wasn't polite either. It was the smile of someone who had already made peace with herself. For years, I had learned how to smile at the right moments. At dinner tables, when remarks cut just enough to sting. At holidays, when expectations piled higher than the dishes in the sink. Smiling had been my shield. But this time, the smile came from a different place. It came from certainty. The decision to leave didn't happen all at once. It came together quietly, piece by piece, over many months. I had been preparing without even realizing it. When I opened my own checking account again, after years of using the shared one, I told myself it was just practical. When I met with a financial advisor, an old friend from church, I said it was about retirement planning. When I placed my parents' deed papers into a fireproof safe of my own, I said it was for organization. The truth was, I was reclaiming ground. That afternoon, I took a long walk along the boardwalk. Families bundled in coats passed me, children laughing, couples holding hands. I didn't feel lonely. I felt present. I thought about how often women my age disappear into service roles, wives, mothers, caregivers, until the lines blur and we forget where we end and others begin. Back home, things were unraveling. Frank called just after noon. I could hear noise in the background, voices clattering dishes, a television turned too loud. "We've got a situation," he said carefully. "I'm listening," I replied. "There's not enough food," he admitted. "Your mom planned on you cooking most of it. She assumed." Assumed. The word landed exactly where it belonged. "I left detailed notes on the pantry door months ago," I said. "You know where everything is." Another pause. "She says the house doesn't feel welcoming." I looked out at the ocean, steady and indifferent. "It's the same house it's always been." He didn't argue. He couldn't. As the day wore on, I imagined Doris fielding questions she had never had to answer before. Where are the extra towels? Who's making dessert? When is dinner actually ready? Her authority had always rested on the assumption that I would quietly handle the execution. Without me, her role was exposed for what it was: direction without labor. I didn't feel triumph. I felt clarity. That evening, I sat at the small dining table in my rental condo and wrote in a notebook I'd brought with me. Not plans, not complaints, just truths. I wrote about how often I had swallowed discomfort to keep the peace, about how being nice had slowly turned into being taken for granted, about how no one had ever asked me if 25 guests were too many, because they never considered the cost to me. I realized something important then. Boundaries don't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes the quietest decisions echo the longest. Late that night, Frank called again. His voice was strained, now edged with fatigue. "Mom says you embarrassed her," he said. "I didn't raise my voice," I replied. "I didn't insult her. I simply chose not to participate." "She says you abandoned the family." I closed my eyes. I stepped away so I wouldn't disappear. There was silence on the line. Then softly, "I didn't see it that way before." That was the crack, small but real. When we hung up, I felt the emotional arc of everything shifting, not toward revenge, but toward reckoning. The power wasn't in watching them struggle. It was in no longer rescuing them from the consequences of their assumptions. I went to bed that night, knowing something irreversible had happened. Not to the family, but to me. I had crossed a line I would never step back over. And whatever waited for me at home, after Christmas, anger, apologies, hard conversations, I would face it standing upright. The smile that started all of this hadn't been defiance. It had been self-recognition. Christmas Day arrived without ceremony for me. No carols drifting from room to room, no oven timer chirping like a nervous bird. Just the steady hush of the ocean and the pale winter sun slipping through the curtains. I sat with my coffee, longer than usual, hands wrapped around the mug, and let myself notice how my body felt when it wasn't bracing for anything. My shoulders were lower, my jaw unclenched. Even my breathing seemed to have found a slower rhythm. Back home, Christmas had always begun before dawn. Doris would be up early, moving loudly through the kitchen opening and closing cabinets, making sure everyone knew she was starting things. I'd follow soon, after tying on my apron, already behind in her mind. This year, there was none of that. I toasted a slice of bread, buttered it carefully, and ate it while standing by the window, watching a gull balance itself against the wind. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. A text from Frank. "Are you okay?" I smiled at the simplicity of it. "Yes," I typed back. "I am." I didn't ask how things were going there. I already knew in a way that didn't require details. 25 people don't simply gather without friction. They don't all agree on temperature, seating, timing, or tradition. And Doris, for all her confidence, had never carried the weight of hosting alone. She had orchestrated. I had executed. Later, as I walked along the shoreline, I let myself imagine the scene back home. Coats piled on the bed, shoes scattered near the door. Someone asking where the trash bags were kept. Someone else wondering aloud why the coffee tasted weak. Doris, standing in the center of it all, smiling too tightly, insisting everything was under control. For years, I had been the quiet buffer between her expectations and reality. Without me, there was no cushion. I didn't take pleasure in that thought. What I felt was distance, emotional distance, that allowed me to see the pattern clearly for the first time. I had been solving problems before anyone else noticed them, anticipating needs, smoothing edges. That kind of work is invisible until it stops being done. In the afternoon, Frank called. The background noise was unmistakable raised voices, the clatter of dishes, a television turned up to drown out the tension. "Dinner's running late," he said, sounding older than he had a week ago. "I'm sorry," I replied, and meant it. Not because I felt responsible, but because I knew what it was like to carry a day like that on your back. "Mom keeps saying you would have known what to do," he added quietly. I closed my eyes. "You know what to do," I said. "You just never had to before." That landed somewhere between us. I could feel it. After we hung up, I sat on a bench and watched families pass, some laughing, some walking a few steps apart, everyone carrying their own version of the day. Christmas has a way of magnifying whatever already exists. Love, resentment, gratitude, entitlement. It doesn't create those things. It reveals them. As evening fell, I made myself a simple dinner. Soup from a local cafe, bread warmed in the oven. I set the table for one, not out of loneliness, but intention. I lit a candle and thought about how often I had eaten standing up in my own kitchen, so others could sit comfortably. Tonight I sat. I ate slowly. I tasted every bite. Back home, the evening unraveled further. Frank called again, his voice low, careful. "Mom's embarrassed," he said. "Some of her friends left early. She said the house felt disorganized." I almost laughed, then stopped. "The house is fine," I said. "What feels disorganized is the expectation that one person will carry everyone else." He was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't realize how much you did," he finally said. There it was, not an apology, not yet, but acknowledgement. For someone like Frank, raised to see his mother as the center of everything, that realization was no small thing. That night, I went to bed, with the window cracked open, the sound of waves filling the room. I thought about Doris, likely exhausted, likely angry, likely confused. I thought about myself, years younger, tying on that apron, for the first time, telling myself this was just how families worked. I understood now that families work best when labor is visible, shared, and respected. When love isn't measured by how much one person is willing to endure in silence. Christmas ended quietly, for me. No fireworks, no dramatic confrontation. Just the steady settling of something long overdue. I wasn't there to witness the mess, but I didn't need to be. The lesson was unfolding without my presence. And for the first time, I trusted it would keep unfolding, whether I intervened or not. I returned home 2 days after Christmas. I didn't announce my arrival. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and let the house speak to me first. The air smelled faintly of burned coffee, and something sweet gone stale. Coats still hung on the rack, heavier than usual, as if no one had bothered to put them away properly. The living room looked tired. Furniture nudged out of place, a half-deflated balloon tucked behind the armchair, a forgotten paper plate on the side table. The house wasn't damaged. It was simply honest. Doris was sitting at the kitchen table. When I walked in, her back straight, hands folded, a stack of envelopes spread in front of her. Frank stood by the sink, rinsing a mug he'd probably washed a dozen times already that morning. He looked up when he saw me, relief flickering across his face. "You're home," he said. "I am," I replied, setting my bag down. Doris didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, her eyes were sharper than usual, but there was something else there too, uncertainty. "We need to talk," she said. "So do I," I answered, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. She gestured to the envelopes. "Your holiday?" She began the word, tight on her tongue, left us with expenses I wasn't expecting. I picked one up and glanced at it. Catering invoices, grocery receipts, utility bills that had doubled with the extra guests. A note from a friend reminding her she'd promised to reimburse for decorations. The quiet machinery of hosting laid bare on paper. "You invited 25 people," I said calmly. "Those costs didn't appear by surprise." She bristled. "This house has always handled Christmas." I met her gaze. "I handled Christmas." Silence settled between us. Frank stopped rinsing and leaned against the counter, listening. Doris drew herself up. "You embarrassed me," she said. "My friends asked where you were. They asked why nothing was ready. They asked, because they assumed I would be doing the work," I said. "The same way you did." Her lips pressed together. "You could have helped." I reached into my bag and placed a slim folder on the table. Inside was a copy of the deed, my parents' names at the top, mine beneath. I slid it toward her. "This house is mine," I said, my voice steady. "It always has been. I never brought it up because I didn't want power. I wanted partnership." Frank's breath caught. "Eleanor, I'm not taking anything away," I continued. "I'm clarifying something that's been ignored." Doris stared at the paper as if it might rearrange itself into a different truth. "So, what," she said, slowly, "you're saying I'm a guest here." "Yes," I replied, "just like everyone else." Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. "I didn't know," she murmured. "You didn't ask," I said, not unkindly. What followed wasn't an apology. Not yet. It was a reckoning, quiet, uncomfortable, necessary. Doris spoke about her fear of becoming irrelevant, of losing her place in the family. I listened. I spoke about exhaustion, about being taken for granted, about how silence had nearly erased me. Frank listened to both of us. For the first time, he didn't rush to smooth things over. "We need boundaries," he said finally. "Real ones." Doris nodded slowly. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "Then don't be," I replied. "Be a participant." That afternoon, we made changes. Shared responsibilities. Clear expectations. No more announcements without agreement. No more assuming my labor was automatic. The house seemed to breathe easier as we spoke. That was the real surprise. Not the deed, not the bills, but the shift. Power didn't change hands with a slam. It changed with honesty. Later that evening, as I put my coat away properly and wiped the counter Doris had missed, I felt something settle into place. Not victory, balance. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not yet, but quieter, in the way a house feels after a storm has passed, and everyone is assessing what needs repair. No one raised their voice. No one pretended nothing had happened. We moved carefully, like people relearning how to walk on a familiar floor that suddenly felt different beneath their feet. Doris kept to herself at first. She spent more time in her room, the door closed, the television low. When she came into the kitchen, she asked, before touching anything, It was awkward, unnatural, but it was also new. Frank surprised me the most. One morning, as I was making oatmeal, he reached for the pot without a word and took over stirring. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table. The gesture was small, almost clumsy, but it landed heavily in my chest. "You don't have to," I began. "I want to," he replied. "I should have wanted to a long time ago." We ate together in silence, not the tense silence we'd mastered over the years, but a thoughtful one, the kind that holds room for regret. Later that afternoon, Doris asked if we could talk. Really talk. We sat in the living room, the Christmas decorations still half up the tree lights, unplugged, but not yet boxed away. She folded her hands the way she always did when she was trying to maintain control, then let them fall into her lap. "I didn't see you," she said quietly, not fully. I waited. "In my day," she continued, "women showed love by doing, cooking, hosting, holding everything together. I thought I was teaching you strength." I nodded slowly. "You taught me endurance," I said. "But endurance without choice turns into resentment." Her eyes filled just slightly. Doris was not a woman who cried easily. I was afraid she admitted, afraid that if I wasn't in charge, I wouldn't matter. I softened then, not because her fear excused her behavior, but because naming it mattered. "You matter," I said, "but not at the cost of my erasing myself." She took a breath, as if those words weighed something loose inside her. "I don't want to lose this family," she said. "Neither do I," I replied. "That's why things have to change." That night, after Doris had gone to bed, Frank and I sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done. The house was quiet, in a way it never had been before. No tension humming beneath the floorboards. "I failed you," he said finally, "by staying neutral." I reached across the table and took his hand. "Neutral always sides with the loudest voice," I said gently. He nodded. "I see that now." We talked about the years ahead, about aging, about care, about what kind of family we wanted to be as things changed. For the first time, those conversations didn't feel like obligations. They felt like plans made by equals. Over the next few days, Doris began to change her habits. She asked instead of instructed. She cooked one evening and cleaned up afterward without commentary. It wasn't perfect. She slipped sometimes. Old patterns don't disappear overnight. But when she did, she caught herself. "I almost said something," she admitted once, stopping mid-sentence. "Old habit." I smiled. "Thank you for noticing." The reckoning wasn't dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no ultimatums. Just a slow, deliberate recalibration of roles and respect. And in that process, I learned something important about myself too. I didn't need to be angry to be strong. I didn't need to punish to be heard. All I had to do was stop disappearing. One evening, as we sat together, watching the news, Doris turned to me and said, "Next year, we'll plan Christmas together. Or keep it small." "That sounds nice," I said. And for the first time, I believed it. By the time January settled in, the house felt different, not quieter, but lighter. The kind of lightness that comes when truth has been spoken, and no one is pretending anymore. The Christmas decorations were finally packed away, the last pine needles vacuumed from the rug, and the kitchen had returned to its ordinary rhythm. But something lasting had shifted beneath the routines. One afternoon, Doris asked if I would sit with her on the back porch. It was cold, but the sun was out, and we wrapped ourselves in old blankets I'd once folded and refolded every winter without a second thought. I've been thinking, she said, staring out at the bare trees, about all the years I came in here and acted like this house was mine. I didn't interrupt. I told myself I'd earn that right, she continued, by raising my son, by being older, by knowing how things were done. She sighed. But I never earned the right to dismiss you. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I said, respect doesn't come from age alone. It comes from how we treat each other. She nodded slowly. I see that now. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no tears, no grand apologies. Just honesty, spoken plainly the way people our age tend to value most. Clear words, no performance. Frank joined us later, carrying 3 mugs of coffee. He handed one to his mother, one to me, then sat between us like a bridge that had finally been reinforced. I want things to stay different, he said. Not just calmer, but fair. They will, I replied, as long as we all remember what this cost. What it had cost wasn't money. It was years of quiet compromise, swallowed feelings, and unspoken resentment. But what it gave back was something far more valuable: dignity. As winter moved on, we settled into new patterns. Doris took responsibility for her own plans. I stopped stepping in to fix things that weren't mine to fix. Frank learned to notice before being asked. None of us were perfect, but none of us were invisible anymore. Sometimes I think back to that moment on the step stool hanging Christmas lights when Doris made her announcement. If I had argued, shouted, or slammed my hand on the counter, nothing would have changed. The noise would have faded and the pattern would have resumed. What changed everything was the quiet choice to step away. That's the lesson I carry with me now, and the one I want to leave with you, especially if you're listening to this and thinking, that sounds like my life, especially if you've spent years being the dependable one, the peacemaker, the invisible engine that keeps everything running. Silence can be a prison, but it can also be a doorway. Boundaries aren't cruel, they're clarifying, and it's never too late at 60, 70, or beyond to say I matter too. If this story touched something familiar in you, I invite you to reflect on it. Maybe even share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, hard-earned dignity, and justice, without shouting, stay with us. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stop explaining and simply stand.